Hello, it's my great pleasure to introduce Frances Poet to our Friends of GRI meetings today. She's here with me today virtually on Zoom, mainly because she's written a play on some pioneering medical women, in particular Sophia Jex Blake, titled Sophia. This will be debuted virtually in August. I'm hoping not to just talk about that, but other things too. Frances has written several plays over the last few years, covering a variety of subjects, including Adam, Fibres and Maggie May. Her debut play was in 2012, which featured in the popular Oran Moore lunchtime programme, A Play, a Pie and a Pint. Declaration of interest though, I have known Frances for over a decade. We met at our local National Childbirth Trust classes. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Frances. Hi Frances. First of all, can you tell me a bit about yourself and your playwriting journey?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, so I started out as a literary manager working in theatres. So my job, I was the literary manager of National Theatre of Scotland. I worked in London before that. So my job was finding new talented writers and supporting sort of emerging voices and supporting the output, all the new writing output of the theatre. So helping developing scripts through to production. Reading lots of plays, watching lots of plays. And then about when we met, when I had my eldest, who is nearly 11.
Can't believe that.
I know, how did that happen? I ended up not going back to National Theatre of Scotland, and I started freelancing a bit and started writing then. And I always know that I was pregnant with my youngest, who's now 8.5, when I had my first play on at Oran Moore. And then I've been lucky enough to have a fair few plays on now, and I still love theatre and write lots of theatre, but I've also written a bit for telly, and so I've written for River City, and I just wrote an episode of a crime drama, which was quite exciting, and writing a film screenplay, and I've written for radio, so it's sort of right across different mediums now.
Yeah. Because as we were talking about, when I first met you, I don't think you'd even started writing any plays at all. So it's been an amazing decade, nearly 11 years for you. I could be wrong. You might have started a wee inkling then, I'm not sure. But what drew you to the story of Sophia Jex Blake? Obviously, she's a pioneering medical woman, and I guess the Edinburgh Seven. So tell us a wee bit about what drew you to that sort of story, her story, and the Edinburgh Seven.
Great. Yeah. Well, I knew you were going to ask that. And funnily enough, I realised that I couldn't remember where I first encountered the story. So it was definitely 2016, and I came across it, and I bought this huge tome, The Life of Sophia Jex Blake by Margaret Todd, and I read it over the Christmas holidays, and I was all geared up wanting to write a play about her. And I wrote to this brilliant organisation called the Tom McGrath Trust and asked them for a grant to go to Cove Park, which is my favourite writers' retreat to go and write new work. Really helpful when you've got young kids and you need to just go away and sort of focus. And Tom McGrath Trust gave me money to go to Cove Park and write it. But whatever it was that had drawn my attention to Sophia Jex Blake must have also drawn the attention of several other writers. So maybe a month before I was due to go to Cove Park, I heard that another writer was developing a sort of musical version of the subject matter. And then I heard there was another writer too who'd got in touch with the theatre and was interested in writing it. So sort of with a heavy heart, I decided to step away from the material, and I ended up writing a different play at Cove Park, and Tom McGrath were very supportive of that. So then it just sat as the play I never got to write and made me a bit sad. And then I was talking to Elizabeth Newman, who runs Pitlochry Festival Theatre, and must have talked about it with such passion And the other writers who'd been developing their projects, they hadn't, as far as I know, sort of ended up coming to life. And so Elizabeth said we should do it. But even then, it wasn't until Pitlochry and Lyceum were doing this new project, really exciting sort of idea that they came up with. They had an inkling that COVID was gonna, you know, keep us on our toes for longer than anyone hoped. And they wanted to come up with a season that they knew would be able to go ahead. No, you know, there was nothing that could change that. And they decided, they followed a model that they'd done with David Gregg. He wrote a play called Painted People, and it was due to go on at Pitlochry, and then with COVID, they ended up doing an audio version of it. And they devised this idea for an entire season of work that is recorded audio, so it can be done totally socially distanced in terms of the recording, and can be listened to and enjoyed by people from their own homes. But Elizabeth is obsessed, sounds extreme, but she's so committed to to what theatre can offer people in terms of countering loneliness, that she didn't just want to sort of put that into the world. She wanted to try and recreate what theatre is able to offer you. And she's come up in conjunction with David at the Lyceum with something really special, actually. So you log in, and then if you want to, you click and you go into the theatre bar, and it takes a little picture of you, and you see a little dot, and you're wandering around the bar, and you might go, oh my goodness, that's Gary. I was hoping I'd see him there. And then you can click and have a Zoom chat. But when I first went on, I didn't see anyone I knew, and almost by accident clicked on someone, and it's someone who goes every year to Pitlochry but who lives in Newcastle. And it was like I'd sort of said, is this table free? And you get into a casual conversation with someone, and it was so joyful. That was the first play, Angela, Mark Ravenhill. So it's quite a special kind of setup, really, and that's what Sophia's going to be part of.
Yeah, so I'm looking forward to signing up for that. But I guess Sophia Jex Blake's story and Edinburgh 7 became more to the forefront again a couple of years ago, when the Edinburgh 7 graduated from Edinburgh University. So I guess part of that highlighting and re-highlighting the story has probably made it more prominent than it did before. But
well, just on that front, I've since found out that she benefited from these wikithons that these women scientists are doing, because Wikipedia, I think when they first started, less than 20% of the entries on Wikipedia were of women. And so there's been this big push, women giving up their time voluntarily, spending a weekend going, right, we'll do it. And they're making sure to kind of highlight these amazing women. So that's, there's a really decent, well-referenced entry for Sophia Jex Blake. And that's because women volunteered their time to make sure that these pioneering women are that we can find out about them in the same way we can the sort of many men that are on Wikipedia.
Absolutely, because I mean, going to university in Glasgow, I don't think I knew about, I'm going to just digress a wee bit about Marion Gilchrist, who was the first female graduate in Scotland, and we didn't really know about her, whereas I'm sure your daughter and my daughter have lots of different books around pioneering women in science and sport and arts, and love them. And it's something that we didn't really have. So I think everything's coming to the forefront, which is really important and really quite pleasing, to be honest. But I'm going to just ask you again, what do you think made it like a theatre-worthy play then? What do you think from Sophia when you started it? And I know you didn't get to do it at Cove Park at that point, but then you did. So why is this story so theatre-worthy?
Yeah, brilliant question. So I the thing that struck me is, I think theatre is just good stories, and drama comes when there are obstacles, when somebody wants something and something gets in the way. And so Sophia's journey is just sort of pure drama. She set her heart on being able to practice as a doctor, gaining a medical degree, and and crashed through obstacle after obstacle after obstacle. And initially what excited me was, I was really interested the fact that that Edinburgh and Scotland were the first place in Britain that were enlightened enough to let them matriculate. That felt really exciting. And in the same breath, really heartbreaking that then they fell at the final hurdle and that actually the women had to get their medical degree in Dublin. So there was something about that, something about Scotland being a land of people who were both progressive and regressive at once, and those two things pulling, that I found quite interesting. But I mean, I think Sophia, she just kept battling. I mean, highlights for me in terms of sort of jaw drop like obstacles. So just to sort of outline it. So Sophia wanted to be an educator. She hadn't set her heart on a medical degree, and she'd gone to Queen's College in London for women, and then she'd come up to Edinburgh to study, to take extra studies, and there's some lovely stories around that. You know, the maths tutor there sort of thought she wasn't going to be any good, and then it turned out that she was better than him, and there were problems that she could solve and he couldn't. It's certainly at Queen's College in London, she'd been taken on as a maths tutor within a couple of months there, so she was incredibly intelligent. But she was in Edinburgh when Elizabeth Garrett, who became Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, was wanting to try and find who'd met Elizabeth Blackwell, who was the first woman doctor who was practicing in America. So actually, Elizabeth Garrett didn't have any idea of being a doctor till she met Elizabeth Blackwell, and meanwhile, Sophia Jex Blake doesn't have any idea until she meets Elizabeth Garrett. But so Sophia tries to help Elizabeth Garrett in Edinburgh, and she gets some introductions and she does that. And that's just the sort of beginning for Sophia. Then she goes to America, all as part of her plan to be an educator. And she visits all these mixed educated schools, and she writes a book on it. And then she gets stuck in America. She meets this amazing woman, Lucy Sewell, in Boston, and Lucy Sewell's father had set her up with a hospital. And Sophia has this introduction to Lucy, starts off helping out, sort of measuring out chemicals, and then ends up sort of learning loads, then getting in touch with Elizabeth Blackwell, writing to Harvard to try and get in the medical school there. Then her father dies. She gets word, she rushes back. Turns out he died before she even got word, but she knew then she couldn't have the Atlantic in the way of her and her mother. So then, she's back in Britain, and so she starts with Edinburgh. That's where she was. That's where she'd started having these meetings for Elizabeth Garrett. Elizabeth Garrett hadn't made any inroads in Edinburgh, had ended up making the most of a loophole with the Society of Apothecaries. And there was a moment when it looked like they weren't going to let her, and her father threatened to sue. They agreed to. They gave her a license that she could practice on through the Society of Apothecaries, and then they closed the loophole. So there's nothing for Sophia now. So she starts knocking on doors in Edinburgh, and she persuades people who if you ask them, do you think women should have a medical education, they'd absolutely say no. And after Sophia's met them a couple of times, they're like, oh well, now you mention it, people had issues about, a woman can't do anatomy, and she'd go, well, I have done it in America. And bit by bit, she sort of made inroads. But Sir Robert Christison, he was the royal physician in Edinburgh, very well respected man. To begin with, he said, I cannot support your cause, but I will not get in your way. And he does not stay true to that. So he ends up at one point saying that threatening to resign if she's taken on. She manages to persuade enough people Christensen was on every governing body. So he was in the medical faculty, he was on the Senate, and he was in the university court. So he's a really powerful influence. But she manages to just pull enough strings. She thinks she has to do it just for herself, a lone exception. And then because Sir Christensen says no over my dead body, the reason they give is you can't be in a mixed class. You'll have to be looked after on your own. We can't have you on your own because that's too much inconvenience for one person. So she goes, great. She puts an advert in the Scotsman. She advertises for more doctors and for more prospective doctors, more women who are intelligent enough to take the matriculation without years of training, and women write back. Initially she has these 4, so the 5 of them will take it. Many of them got the top grade. They beat all the men in that matriculation exam, and so they matriculate. Amazing. But then the obstacles keep coming. Then the big difficulties: can they get into the hospital to do the rounds? They can't have a medical degree if they've not got that practical experience. But there's all sorts of practical difficulties in the hospital, and it starts to feel like the only way they're going to do it is to have these mixed classes, and that's when they have the backlash of them knocking away at the hospital is what creates this massive riot, where Christensen's assistant is a big prominent person in the riot. Now, Sophia speaks out of turn here. So there's a meeting. I'm sorry, I'm giving you quite the long-winded.
No, not at all. I'm really enjoying this.
Okay. So there's a meeting to elect a new board of the infirmary, which is where they're trying to get this practical experience. So Sophia goes, and what was supposed to be a small meeting becomes it has to relocate to a huge church, and there's all these members of the public there. And Sophia stands up and she says this riot was not students objecting to the women. We had 5 weeks of calm, wonderful lectures in this mixed group. The lecturer, Professor Handyside, said he'd never had such calm, attentive lectures. So ostensibly, it looks like it was the fellow students saying, we can't be expected to study with the women. But she says it wasn't that. It was only when we were trying to get into the infirmary that actually the lecturers started agitating, started creating this backlash with the male students. But at that moment, poor old Sophia reports what she has been told about Sir Christensen's assistant, and that he is that he was there, that he was drunk, and she ends up getting sued for libel because she hadn't seen him, she couldn't prove that he was there. When he sues her, he doesn't deny that he was there or that he was drunk or he did any of that, just that she couldn't prove it, therefore she wasn't able to speak it. So they award her hardly any damages, but she has to pay all the expenses. It's £900, but luckily public attention really sort of everyone supported them after this injustice. But the injustice keeps going. So after this riot, it ends up, and eventually the only way the university can get out, because they want to graduate, and in order to graduate they need access to the hospital, they need to be lectured in core subjects. So Robert Christensen lectures some of the core subjects, he needs to lecture them for them to graduate. Eventually it hits a point, the university need to get out of this situation, and so they decide that the Senate performed an illegal act allowing them to matriculate in the first place. So it's dead. So then they have to work out what to do. Do they need to get there? That, you can go to Paris, to Zurich, there are other places you can go, and they're letting women study. And Elizabeth Garrett felt that that's what they should do. They should come back. They should pass with flying colours, as all these incredible women did, and they should just set up without a British licence. But Sophia didn't want that. That erodes at the quality. That wasn't. She was determined. At one point, it looked like there was another loophole with the Society of Midwives. So they all get ready. They brush up on the midwifery. This is, they describe it as a sorry thing to practice on for people who want a broader medical degree, but it will do. And every single examiner on the board resigns, so that they can't take it. The obstacles are just horrendous. And eventually Sophia takes it to Parliament, and she manages over years to create this enabling bill that allows universities, and Ireland was the first one, and they were able to go to Dublin after they'd taken their exams in German in Bern and got their medical degree there. Amazing. Then went to Ireland and fine. And what I've always found intriguing about the story is that after all that battling in Edinburgh, Sophia comes back to Edinburgh. She's the first woman doctor in Scotland, and there was something about that I was really attracted to.
Yeah, and it's amazing the obstacles you're talking about, because they were permitted to teach them, but they didn't have to teach them, or something that, you know, the doctors were but not required, and it's just all these obstacles, and it just resonates how hard they had to work at it and keep at it, and they did do amazingly well. I can't remember, it was Edith Petchey, I think, got the top chemistry mark, and then this caused a huge kerfuffle because she did, and
the Hope Scholarship.
That was the Hope Scholarship,
which had come about. The money for the scholarship had come from women, so it was particularly galling that she wasn't then awarded it. And Professor Crumb Brown, he got himself in this very tricky position where, because he was teaching the women separately from the men, he felt that was a different class and it wasn't really fair, so he gave it to the man who'd scored less than Edith Petchey. And again, that was another thing that got sort of public support for them, really.
Yeah, I think it was all over the papers of the day, like all of the sort of actions that he did.
Well, that scholarship came with money and access to a lab, and Edith Petchey had limited means. Sophia paid, those women were paying more for their classes than the men because they were a smaller group, so they were having to pay more. Sophia was covering a lot of Edith. Edith lived with Sophia. And the really galling thing, when finally the university court decided that it was illegal the Senate acted illegally letting them matriculate, they made the women pay the costs of them making that decision. Years of them paying top dollar for their classes, then they made them pay that. I mean, it's just staggering.
Yeah. So obviously I've read a bit about Sophia Jex Blake myself. So and from what you've said, it sounds like she was a bit of a forceful character, but some of that, I guess, could be written in retrospect. What do you think about her? As obviously you've studied a lot about her to do your play. So what do you think of her as a person?
Yes, I think she was amazing, but I think she was a force to be reckoned with. I mean, she was difficult. I think she gave everything to the fight. And when people didn't give everything, she was judgmental. She was hard. There's a moment when the seven of them studying in Edinburgh, over about a 4-month period, 3 of the women got engaged, and she was furious. Where is your commitment to the cause? And one of them, Mary Chapman, I think it is, her husband died 4 months later. So I think maybe Sophia felt slightly chastened after that, having given her a hard time, and then the marriage didn't, they didn't get the long marriage that they should have hoped.
But I remember reading about that as well, and that Jex Blake's comments around that were pretty harsh. I think that's fair to say.
And she made a lot of enemies. So the bit of her life that we haven't talked about. So she said when it fails in Edinburgh, she decides it's time for, and we're taking advice as well, that it's time for a women's medical school. And of course, for Sophia, she wanted to be an educator. She did all of that studying towards that goal. So now to set up a school, she gets to be the educator and the doctor. This is a really big moment for her. And at first, when she sets it up, Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, by now she is, says she doesn't think it's the right time. She's very, she's very reticent about it. Sophia, in her very, she was a fighter. She was uncompromising. She was bullish. She just plows ahead. she didn't have Elizabeth Garrett Anderson's tact or diplomacy. She just was a kind of wrecking ball, and she plows ahead. She makes this school. She kind of bullies Elizabeth onto the board. And then the school gets stolen from under her when she's in Ireland taking her exam. And she wanted to be honorary secretary, but she wanted to have a medical degree before she was acting as honorary secretary, but she wanted to have a medical degree to become that. And when she's in Ireland taking the exam, they have a meeting, and her name is put forward by Isabel Thorne, one of the seven, seconded, and then someone else proposes Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, and Elizabeth accepts the nomination. And you know, Elizabeth was the respectable face. She'd been 12 years, she'd been the only doctor in Britain. So, but Sophia's response was, anyone but you can run my school. You didn't have faith in me. And in the end, so, you know, Sophia has to leave that school, starts up a new one in Edinburgh. And then we have this another flipping battle. So she was certainly difficult, where she, there was the Cadell sisters were two students. And so the hospital access was huge. The hospital access was the thing that caused the problem in Edinburgh, led to the riots. In London, it was the reason, really, that Elizabeth, more respectable, could ease things along, that Sophia got nudged out of her school there. So in Edinburgh, Sophia wasn't going to take any risks. And there was an issue where the matron was very angry with it was agreed the women would leave at 5 o'clock, and they were treating a patient, and they refused to leave until they'd finished treating the patient. And it was a bit of a hoo-ha. And Sophia demanded that those sisters wrote a letter of apology to the matron. They felt that she bullied them into doing it. They retracted the letter. She expelled them from the school. They then sued her for unfair dismissal and won. She had to pay them £50 in damages. Meanwhile, their friend, who I think you were possibly going to mention, she who was friends with them and had means because of her father, sets up a rival school, undercuts the cost of the lessons, and Sophia loses a second school because of her bullishness. So there is no doubt that I don't think it's a rewriting of history. I think she was the right woman. There's a lovely thing that is written about by a lover of hers, Ursula de Prey, in a letter. She writes, even a battering ram will wear down after enough sieges. And I think Sophia was a battering ram, and that is how she created the change. That is how she won the battle. But battering rams, she didn't have the tact and sensitivity, and often that did end up, causing her big difficulties.
And then I wondered about, I'm not sure how much you looked into her later life. Was there anything there that you found interesting? Yes, I'm glad you asked, because the thing I haven't told you about, so it was interesting, when I first wanted to write the play, I wanted to just tell Sophia's story. And it was only when I came back to it in 2020 that I realised, possibly because of this Wikithon and a bit more information, that Margaret Todd, who wrote the 600-page tome biography that I'd worked my way through, Margaret Todd was Sophia Jex Blake's lover of 20 years. And Margaret has not written herself into the biography. And there's something about the act of selfless love of that breaks my heart. And so the play that I've written for the soundstage production, absolutely, Margaret is as significant a character. And so Margaret was, she was one of these first students. She'd been a teacher in Glasgow. I think she was born in Fife originally, and she was one of the early students, along with Elsie and the Cadell sisters, and but she took much longer to get her degree because she was also a novelist. So she wrote this book called Mona McLean, which was about a young woman doctor. And I think at the time it caused a bit of a sensation, because it was, that was quite exciting for
for readers to kind of get access to this world of women and women doctors.
But it was under a pseudonym, was it? She wrote it under as a
Graham
male.
Travis.
I couldn't
Graham
remember the name.
Travis was her pen name, yeah. And so when the school dies, when Sophia has Edinburgh University, through more campaigning, has finally agreed to accept women students, and this is towards the end of the 1800s now, Sophia retires and she goes to live in Sussex and has this long retirement with Margaret, a long, very happy retirement. And when Sophia dies, Margaret spends 6 years writing this love letter to Sophia, incredibly detailed. There was a criticism at the time, but basically, the subtext was flippin' heck, it's way too detailed. And she, because I think Sophia was a massive hoarder. She kept all these letters, all these papers, and Margaret spent 6 years working her way through them, creating this amazing tome. And you think about the Wickathons, and you realise that actually Margaret's contribution in committing that battle to paper was huge, but she didn't write herself into it. And so, and now I haven't been able to find a source for this, but Margaret, she publishes the book. 3 months later, she dies. And the little bit of information online implies that she took her own life. So she really, she's lost. She was 17 years younger than Sophia, but she's lost when Sophia dies. She commits herself to writing this biography and then ends it all. So I think that the play tells Sophia's story, but also tells this sort of other story about Margaret Todd, who was a doctor, was an amazing woman, a novelist,
and used the word isotope for the very first time. That's Margaret Todd. And it's the thing where she was in the University of Glasgow and you're like, I didn't know any of this at all when I was younger.
I know.
She coined the phrase isotope. This is what we use all the time. I find it utterly amazing. Just when you start, it's like you go down one path and then you're out to a sort of 10 other paths about everything else, which I really...
Oh my goodness. Well, the first woman Sophia loved was Octavia Hill, who was a big reformer of housing in London and hated sort of the poverty in London. Then you've got Elizabeth Garrett Anderson's sister mind block now. She's a very famous suffragette. Millicent Fawcett.
Millicent Fawcett, is it not?
Yeah. That's what the surnames were confusing me for a minute. Yeah, that's her sister. So it's this web. You kind of go, oh, well, I'm looking at this one extraordinary woman. You're like, yeah, but look at everybody next to her. It's amazing.
And part of that, I guess, is the group of women that were trying to do that. It started off small, I guess, as well. So there would be a small circle of people involved with this, and then it grew larger and larger. And I think that's partly it as well. I guess it sort of did grow arms and legs, and that's where you do get down the alleyways, I guess. But I guess you've already spoken about Margaret Todd, so I might digress and think about... So through Sophia Jex Blake's fight and struggle and obviously eventual graduation 100 years later, do you see any parallels with inclusion today and struggles that people have, or is there anything that that from the play that you think is relevant parallels for today?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think it's there's a phrase that she used a lot in her letters, which is a fair field and no favour, and that's what they were fighting for. There's one letter she wrote in response to someone who'd written to the Times, and he talked about mental equity, and he'd said that women clearly didn't have the mental equity of men, because look, all the scientific breakthroughs throughout history had been achieved by men. And her response is beautiful. She says, look, I'm not claiming mental equity for women. All I'm saying is, and all my fellow students are saying, is tell us what the requirements are to obtain a medical degree. Fix your standard where you please, put no obstacles in our way. And if we achieve that standard, then that is it, settled. Then let us practice, and our patients will decide for themselves whether we're any good. You know, all she was fighting for was an equal playing field. And I think there is no minority that wouldn't hear that argument and go, that's where just give us an equal playing field. That we're not asking for extra favors, we're not asking for this or that. Just remove the obstacles, just even admit the obstacles that face us. So I mean, what I found quite a revelation was when I attended a lecture that you were involved in as part of Lister Week, and the discussion about prominent women surgeons was discussed about the fact that actually surgery is still to this day perceived as more a masculine area, and I might get this wrong because it was new information for me, but that the first woman president of a society of surgeons was only 20 years ago, and it was in Ireland. And I love that it was in Ireland because that echoed Sophia Jex Blake. But what I found fascinating about that discussion, of course, you know, I'm a writer, I don't know the world of doctors, but that moment of going, these things take a long time to rectify. There's Sophia knocking at the gates in the 1870s, finally getting somewhere in late 1890s. 120 years on, the hundreds of years of inequality is still evident. You would be able to speak to that better than I would in your field.
And people could listen again to the college YouTube or the college YouTube channel. I do think it's interesting. Obviously, progress has been made, but then we look at other areas for inclusion as well. And I think we still are working on lots of different areas in medicine in particular. Now, I'm going to digress a bit because I wanted to take this opportunity to talk about a different play that I really liked. It's called Fibres, and it was adapted for the BBC recently for their Scenes for Survival. I'm sure in collaboration with lots of other things that I've completely forgotten, so please forgive me. But it was part of the Citizens, so this is another women's, it was part of the Citizens Women's Week, I think, or Women's Season a couple of years ago. And it's a really touching story. I remember when we were talking about it initially, so maybe you might want to talk to me about Fibres and the story behind that, because it kind of resonates today, particularly in Women's Week as well, about the sort of premise of it. But it's also got a medical link too, so that's probably, I'm going to let you talk about it now.
Well, it turns out that there's very few plays that I don't need to come and knock on Morven's door for some help with, and Sophia was one, and a play I wrote, Maggie May, which was about dementia, was another one. But Fibres, absolutely, my sort of early thoughts about Fibres, you were able to really sort of help develop it for me because of your experience. So just to set the context, so I was this is quite a few years ago now. I was at a music class with my daughter, and a woman was there with her godson, and she, after the class, we'd get a chance to chat, and I'd known her for a few weeks, and then out of the blue she just told me one day that her parents had died 6 months apart, and her father had been a ship's draftsman. He'd done a 3-day apprenticeship at the ships and been covered in asbestos, snowball fights with it, all of this stuff. His wife had washed his clothes, and all those decades later, he died of mesothelioma and his wife died 6 months later. So I knew a little bit about the legacy of asbestos. It was sort of in my head. I actually hadn't had a personal connection to it. Since writing Fibres, I barely speak to a person who doesn't have the amount of people, you know, on the school run, and someone says, oh, my uncle died of that, oh, my granddad died of that, my grandmother, you know, it's so depressingly prolific. But I at first I knew of it, I was aware of it. What I didn't know was that the women who washed the clothes were also dying of this, and until a very recent landmark case in Scotland, they weren't provided for by the insurers. The companies knew the harm that the asbestos was doing to their workers. Their money was put aside. There were all sorts of dodgy practices where settlements were drawn out, and that meant that once someone had died, that meant that they either didn't need to pay out or could pay out much less, until finally there was a big, all the solicitors were drawn into a questionnaire, you know, is it in your interest to drag it out? And they all went, yeah, it is. And the law was changed around that. So there was a landmark case recently where a woman was awarded it, not having been directly impacted by her place of work, but her husband's place of work. But so, yeah, I became fascinated by it, and the fact that at different periods in the last 20 years, Glasgow has been the asbestos capital in Europe and the world. You know, I've found different statistics at different points because of this shipbuilding legacy. I mean, it's not just shipbuilding, it's in schools, it's in construction, you know, it's really frightening that it's in schools, you know, it's in my kids' school, that they have a policy around it, but it, you know, and I did a post-show discussion when Fibres was on, and this wonderful woman from the Action on Asbestos organisation said, I don't want another play to be written in 25 years. I don't want to be sitting in the audience of another play written in 25 years when it's about the school kids who've been around it, and you just go, oh. Yes, you know, I remember reading the deaths from asbestos-related diseases cost the NHS more than car accidents, than road traffic accidents. You just go, we're all paying for this. We're all and as I researched it more, you know, the first, you know, in Britain, there was a woman, Lucy, I forget her name now. Oh, that's very annoying. See, I'm so in Sophia world, I've forgotten my research for Fibres. But at the, you know, but actually the time that Edinburgh's accepting women in the late 1890s, this woman, Lucy, is discovering in textile factories the impact of asbestos. By the 1930s, America refused to, the insurance companies refused to insure people who were working with it. And yet in the 60s, 70s, 80s in Scotland, people are being exposed to it. And it, you know, I think I remember when I first started talking to you about it, you said, yeah, but Frances, it's not set to, I think at that point it was, deaths from it weren't set to peak till 2020. And I don't know whether they've extended that now, or whether we're on the,
admit ignorance about the peak again. I haven't, I should have read that before we came on here, but peak wise, it's I don't think it's quite peaked yet, but my respiratory colleagues will pick me up on that one. But yeah, so it's still ongoing. What I really loved about the play, but when we're talking about it, we were talking about echoes of it was just how you wrote, the way you wrote some of the phrases around it. It just was amazing, and made me realise that I'm just a very scientific doctor.
But you gave me you told me something really interesting. So it was called Fibres, which obviously references the asbestos fibres, but also there were lots of ideas in the play about sort of cords that tie people, and there were different ways in which fibres resonated. But you told me early on that the in this sort of drainage sites, the mesothelioma, I've forgotten the name for it now, the mesothelioma sort of travels along that site. And sort of lumps up as if it's trying to come out, and that you know, that sense of you know, of it kind of reaching out to meet the wife became a sort of part of the play.
But we're actually really almost out of time, I think. So it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you today, Frances. I'm sure the audience will look forward to joining us for Sophia in August, and also
yes,
maybe watch into the BBC to Fibre's. I think it's called A Mugs Game. The Fibre's one.
Yes.
So it's a monologue with Jonathan Watson. So I'm sure people want to look into that too. So anyway, thank you very much, Frances, for joining us today.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.